Chapter 1. The City of Angels and Devils. Los Angeles, California. October 23, 1871. Dr. Jean Tong locked the door to his medical practice on Calle de los Negros and paused, listening to the sounds of the evening crowd gathering in Negro Alley. Laughter spilled from the saloons. A guitar played somewhere nearby. Horses stamped and snorted as wagons rumbled past on the unpaved street. Jean Tong was 42 years old, one of the most respected physicians in Los Angeles Chinese community, and tonight he had a bad feeling he couldn't shake. For 3 days, tensions had been building between the Nin Yung and Hong Chau companies over a woman named Yut Ho. Yesterday, there had been a hearing in Justice Gray's court. Today, the feuding groups had returned to Negro Alley, and Jean Tong, who had no connection to either faction, found himself trapped in the middle of something that was about to explode. He was right to be worried. In 24 hours, he would be dead, lynched by a mob of 500 Americans who would kill 18 Chinese residents in what would become the largest mass lynching in United States history. Negro Alley, 1871. Los Angeles in 1871 was a frontier city of nearly 6,000 people, violent and lawless, with a higher murder rate than New York or Chicago, despite employing only 6 police officers. Lynchings and mob justice were commonplace. The Chinese population numbered just 172, roughly 3% of the city's total. More than half lived in the adobes along Calle de los Negros, Negro Alley, a 500-foot unpaved street running from Arcadia Street to the plaza. The street's name came from dark-skinned Spaniards who'd originally lived there, but by 1871, it had deteriorated into what Los Angeles historian Morro Mayo later described as a dreadful thoroughfare filled entirely with saloons, gambling houses, dance halls, and cribs, crowded night and day with people of many races, male and female, all rushing and crowding along from one joint to another. Jean Tong had established his medical practice there because that's where the Chinese community lived. He treated miners with lung diseases, laundry workers with chemical burns, cooks with knife wounds from kitchen accidents. He delivered babies, set broken bones, and prescribed herbs imported from China for ailments that Western medicine didn't understand. He was also, whether he liked it or not, witness to the violence that plagued Negro Alley. The woman called Yut Ho. The trouble had started months earlier with a woman named Xing Yu, a Chinese prostitute who'd been abducted, tortured, and fought over by rival factions. In November 1870, 5 men had suspended her over a fire, burned her legs and abdomen, and cut her back lengthwise. 4 were convicted, but the California Supreme Court overturned their sentences on technicalities. That case had ignited a feud between Yo Hing, leader of the Hong Chau Company, and his rivals that continued for nearly a year. In March 1871, seeking revenge, Yo Hing's men kidnapped another woman, Yut Ho, the wife of a man named Heng Shun. She was dragged to a judge's office and forced through a fake marriage ceremony to one of Yo Hing's associates, Li Leung. Yut Ho's brother was a young man named Ah Choi. On October 23, 1871, Ah Choi decided he'd had enough. October 24, 1871, 5 p.m. About 1 hour after hearings in Justice Gray's court ended, Ah Choi was eating his evening meal in a house on the east side of Negro Alley when he heard commotion outside. He went to the front door and found Yo Hing and 3 others armed with pistols. One of them shot Ah Choi in the neck. Yo Hing and the others ran down the stairs at the corner of Aliso and Los Angeles Street. Constable Jesus Bilderain was on horseback at the corner of Main and Arcadia when he heard the shots. He rode toward Negro Alley and saw Chinese men in the corridor of the Boudry building shooting at each other. He dismounted and moved to arrest one of the gunmen. That's when someone inside the Coronel Adobe, a complex of buildings where many Chinese residents lived and worked, shot Constable Bilderain in the shoulder. A civilian named Robert Thompson, a popular former saloon owner, rushed to help. Thompson approached the door of Sam Ewan's store in the Coronel building and fired 2 shots inside. Someone inside fired back, hitting Thompson in the chest. Thompson staggered back. "I'm killed," he said. He was carried to Woolweber's drugstore, where he died 2 hours later. The mob form's news of Thompson's death spread through Los Angeles like wildfire, twisted by rumor into something far worse than reality. The Chinese community in Negro Alley were killing whites wholesale, people whispered. Never mind that only one white man had died, killed in a gunfight between Chinese factions that had nothing to do with him. By 8 p.m., a crowd of 500 men, 8% of the entire city's population, had gathered around the boundaries of Negro Alley. They were white and Latino, Americans and immigrants, laborers and businessmen, united by rage and the opportunity for violence. City Marshal Frank Baker assigned guards to the Coronel Adobe with orders to prevent anyone from leaving. Three-term Mayor Cristobal Aguilar surveyed the situation and then left, doing nothing to stop what was coming. Inside the Adobe buildings, Jean Tong and dozens of other Chinese residents barricaded themselves in their homes and shops, terrified. Most had no connection to the shooting. Most didn't even know what had happened. They only knew that an angry mob surrounded them, and Los Angeles had a long history of mob violence. The lynching begins, 8:45 p.m. The first door was battered down at approximately 8:45 p.m. Men climbed onto the roof of the Coronel building with ladders, axes in hand. Sheriff Burns later counted 11 men on the roof. They cut holes through the ceiling and fired down into the rooms below, forcing occupants to flee outside where the mob waited. The first victim was a man named R. Wing. The crowd captured him, found a weapon, and dragged him to Tomlinson's Corral, the same gate where another victim had been lynched less than a year before. They hanged him from the crossbeam. Groups of men started pulling Chinese residents from the buildings and leading them away from Negro Alley. Marshal Baker and Sheriff Burns individually gave parties instructions to take the Chinese to jail for safety. Some groups did lead their captives safely to the county jail, but other groups led men to John Goller's wagon shop to be hanged. John Goller protested that his children were present. A rioter pressed a gun to his face and said, "Dry up, you son of a bitch." 7 bodies were hanged from the crossbar of Goller's portico. When that beam was full, the crowd dragged 3 more victims to a nearby freight wagon and hanged them from the high side. At least one victim was mutilated. A member of the mob cut off his finger to steal his diamond ring. Jean Tong's last moments. Dr. Jean Tong was pulled from his medical practice sometime after 9 p.m. He had no weapon. He had participated in no shooting. He had been working in his office, treating patients, when the mob broke down his door. It didn't matter. The mob dragged him to one of the makeshift gallows. A few people in the crowd tried to intervene. Attorney Robert M. Whitney, who would later become the district judge presiding over the trials, attempted to calm the mob. General John Baldwin remonstrated with the lynching parties at Tomlinson's Corral. A group of men, including C. White and John Lazarovich, managed to rescue 4 Chinese from the mob. They couldn't save Jean Tong. At approximately 9:30 p.m., Sheriff Burns addressed the crowd and requested 25 volunteers to help preserve the peace and guard the building until morning. By then, the killing was essentially over. Morning after. The next morning, 17 bodies were laid out in the jail yard. The 18th victim, R. Wing, the first man hanged, had been buried the night before. 10% of Los Angeles's Chinese population had been murdered in a single night. The dead included Dr. Jean Tong, physician Leong Kwai, laundryman Ah Long, cigar maker, 6 cooks, Wan Fu, Tong Wan, Dai Ki, Ah Wah, Ho Hing, Lo Hei, Ah Wan, and Wing Chi Wong Chin, storekeeper. And 9 others, many so young their occupations weren't even recorded. Of all the victims, only one, possibly Ah Choi, shot in the initial gunfight, had participated in the original shooting that triggered the massacre. The tragedy would be quickly forgotten. Local newspapers made no mention of it in their year-end recap of major events. 10 men were prosecuted. 8 were convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison terms ranging from 2 to 6 years. On appeal, the California Supreme Court overturned all convictions on a technicality. The indictment had failed to explicitly state that the victims were dead. The 8 convicted men walked free in 1873. None were ever retried. The Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871 was one of the largest mass lynchings in American history. Within weeks, it was erased from public memory, a crime without consequences. Justice denied not through failure, but through deliberate choice. Jean Tong's widow filed a complaint trying to hold someone, anyone, accountable. It went nowhere. This is the story of how it happened and why 172 Chinese residents learned that in America, some lives didn't matter at all. Chapter 2. The Trials That Failed Los Angeles, California, November 8, 1871. 2 weeks after the massacre, County Court Judge Ignacio Sepulveda stood before a specially convened grand jury and spoke words that would prove painfully prophetic. "Lawlessness has again raised its monster head in our midst," he began, his voice echoing through the courtroom, "and in the most inhuman manner has satiated its barbarous instincts." He reminded the jury of a similar moment just 10 months earlier, when another mob had lynched a man named Michel Lachesnais. Back then, Sepulveda had begged the grand jury to act. They had refused. Now he asked again, "Will you do likewise in this instance?" His final question hung in the air. Shall law stand for naught? Tong Yu demands justice. On November 4, 1871, 11 days after watching her husband lynched by a mob, a woman named Tong Yu walked into the Justice Court and filed a criminal complaint. Dr. Jean Tong's widow accused Yo Hing, leader of the Hong Chow Company, of inciting and participating in the massacre that led to her husband's death. Yo Hing was arrested and held pending investigation. It was an extraordinary act of courage. Tong Yu had every reason to flee Los Angeles, to return to China, to disappear into grief and anonymity. Instead, she confronted the legal system that had failed to protect her husband and demanded it deliver justice for his murder. The grand jury examined her complaint. They could find no direct evidence linking Yo Hing to the mob violence. The initial gunfight between rival Chinese factions had triggered the massacre, but Yo Hing himself hadn't participated in the lynchings. He was released. Tong Yu's complaint went nowhere. But her act of defiance, a Chinese widow demanding accountability from American courts, represented something the mob could never destroy: the refusal to accept that her husband's life didn't matter. The Chinese community in Los Angeles would not simply vanish into silence. The grand jury indicts. Judge Sepulveda's grand jury worked through November, examining 111 witnesses over 23 days. On December 2nd, they issued their report with 49 indictments containing more than 150 individual names. Only a handful were actually arrested. Charles Austin, a laborer; Edmund Crawford, a teamster; Alexander Johnson, a shoemaker who'd claimed drunkenness had clouded his memory; Jesus Martinez, a resident of the Pueblo; Louis Mendel, a railroad worker; D.W. Moody, whose occupation went unrecorded; Patrick MacDonald, an Irishman; Andreas Suhr, a Frenchman; and A.L. Curly Crenshaw, who would become the first to stand trial. The vast majority of those indicted simply disappeared. They walked Los Angeles streets freely, knowing that understaffed law enforcement would never pursue them all. 150 men participated in 18 murders. 9 would face trial. The trial of Curly Crenshaw. On February 16, 1872, Curly Crenshaw stood accused of being an accessory to the murder of Dr. Jean Tong. Before testimony could begin, defense attorneys James G. Howard and E.J.C. Kewen challenged the indictment itself, arguing it was technically flawed because it never explicitly stated that Jean Tong was dead, only that the accused had encouraged others to kill and murder him. Judge Robert M. Whitney, the attorney who tried to stop the lynchings and now presided as judge, ruled that the language was sufficient. Any person of common understanding would know the indictment meant Tong had been killed. This technical point would prove catastrophically important later. Jury selection became an interrogation about vigilantism. Defense attorneys questioned every potential juror about whether they had ever been part of a vigilance committee or sympathized with vigilante justice. After 3 weeks and 255 potential jurors questioned across 5 jury calls, a panel was finally seated. The trial lasted 2 days. Several prosecution witnesses testified seeing Crenshaw on the roof of the Coronel Building, one of the locations where the mob had trapped Chinese residents. Benjamin McLaughlin delivered the most damning testimony. He'd seen Crenshaw climb onto the roof and later heard him boasting about killing 3 Chinese people. Crenshaw took the stand in his own defense. He claimed he'd been helping put out a fire, escorted a Chinese woman to jail at an officer's request, then went to Billy Rapp's saloon for drinks before heading home. He had a gun, but never fired it, and he absolutely denied boasting about killing anyone. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. The vote was 11-1 for conviction on murder charges. 1 juror held out. Judge Whitney allowed them to consider the lesser charge of manslaughter instead. All 12 agreed, guilty of manslaughter. Crenshaw's sentencing was delayed while his attorneys prepared an appeal. People versus Mendel and others. The remaining defendants, Louis Mendel, D.W. Moody, Jesus Martinez, A.R. Johnson, Charles Austin, Patrick MacDonald, Refugio Botelho, Adolfo Celis, and Esteban Alvarado, were tried together in a single proceeding that stretched from late February into March. By the time testimony finally began on March 22nd, public interest had evaporated. The Los Angeles News observed that the trial attracts but little interest, and judge, jury, counsel, witnesses, and prisoners exhibit more than ordinary weariness. The trial followed the same pattern as Crenshaw's. Witnesses described general violence, but couldn't definitively place specific defendants at the scene of Tong's murder. Defense attorneys Howard and Kewen filed motion after motion, arguing lack of evidence of conspiracy, failure to prove premeditation, and, again, that the prosecution never explicitly proved Jean Tong was actually dead. Judge Whitney denied every motion. Then Howard and Kewen made a stunning tactical decision. They declined to present any defense witnesses at all. They rested their case without calling a single person to the stand. At 1 a.m. on March 27, 1872, nearly 5 months after the massacre, the jury returned. The courtroom, nearly empty during the trial, was suddenly thronged with a curious crowd. After 3 hours of deliberation, the verdict came. 7 men guilty of manslaughter, 2 acquitted. Louis Mendel, A.R. Johnson, Charles Austin, Patrick MacDonald, Jesus Martinez, Refugio Botelho, and Esteban Alvarado would go to prison. D.W. Moody and Adolfo Celis walked free. On March 30th, Judge Whitney handed down sentences. Refugio Botelho, 2 years, A.L. Crenshaw, 3 years. Charles Austin, 5 years. Patrick MacDonald, 5 years. Jesus Martinez, 5 years. A.R. Johnson, 6 years. Louis Mendel, 6 years. All would serve their time at San Quentin State Prison. 8 men convicted, 18 people murdered, 150 indicted. The Los Angeles Star wrote that the result would have a very salutary effect in restraining the lawless class in the city, and proved that juries can be obtained in our midst to punish evildoers. The Chinese community responds. While the trials proceeded, the Chinese community of Los Angeles began an act of collective resistance that has been largely forgotten by history. In 1872, at least 14 of the 15 Chinese laundrymen in Los Angeles refused to pay their city business license fees. It was, according to contemporary accounts, possibly the first example of Chinese-American civil disobedience, a coordinated protest against a city that had failed to protect them and then failed to deliver justice. The city could imprison Chinese residents for non-payment. It could fine them, shut down their businesses, drive them from Los Angeles entirely. But it could not make them pretend that justice had been served. Some Chinese residents responded differently. Contemporary observers noted that after the massacre, certain members of the community displayed their culture even more boldly despite the danger. wearing traditional clothing more openly, celebrating festivals more publicly, refusing to hide or apologize for their existence. It was an assertion that the mob had failed in its ultimate goal, to make Chinese people disappear. Tong Yu, Jean Tong's widow, continued her fight. She filed civil suits seeking damages for her husband's murder. The suits went nowhere. California law prohibited Chinese testimony against white defendants, and no white witnesses would support her claims. But she tried. Against a legal system designed to deny her standing, against a society that considered her husband's life worthless, she demanded to be heard. The appeals begin. The 8 convicted men didn't accept their sentences quietly. Their attorneys immediately filed appeals to the California Supreme Court, arguing that Judge Whitney had erred in allowing the convictions to stand despite the technically flawed indictment. The argument was simple and infuriating. The indictment stated that the defendants had encouraged others to kill and murder Jean Tong, but never explicitly stated that Tong had actually died. Therefore, the indictment was legally insufficient, and the convictions should be overturned. It was the same argument Judge Whitney had dismissed as absurd 5 months earlier. Any person of common understanding knew what the indictment meant. Jean Tong was dead. His body had been laid out in the jail yard. His widow had filed complaints. The coroner had examined his corpse. But the law doesn't always operate on common understanding. Sometimes it operates on technicalities. In Sacramento, the California Supreme Court began reviewing the appeals. The convicted men sat in San Quentin, awaiting a decision that would determine whether they served their full sentences or walked free. In Los Angeles, Tong Yu waited too, hoping that somehow the justice system would recognize what everyone already knew. Her husband had been murdered, and the men who killed him should be punished. She would be disappointed. The story of the Los Angeles Chinese massacre of 1871 was about to become something even worse than a crime without punishment. It was about to become a crime officially erased, justice denied not through failure to prosecute, but through deliberate choice to release convicted killers on the thinnest possible legal pretext. The Supreme Court's decision was coming, and it would prove that in 1870s California, some lives truly didn't matter at all. Chapter 3. Justice Erased Sacramento, California. Late 1872. The 8 convicted men sat in San Quentin State Prison while their attorneys argued before the California Supreme Court. The appeal rested on a single point so technical, so absurd, that Judge Whitney had dismissed it without hesitation 5 months earlier. The indictment stated that the defendants had encouraged others to kill and murder Jean Tong. But it never explicitly stated that Jean Tong had actually died. Therefore, the defense argued, the indictment was legally insufficient. The convictions must be overturned. District Attorney Cameron Tom prepared his response, confident that the Supreme Court would see through this transparent legal manipulation. Jean Tong's body had been laid out in the jail yard. His widow had filed complaints. The coroner had examined his corpse. 17 other bodies had been buried alongside his. How could anyone argue that the indictment's failure to include the words, "and he died," invalidated 8 convictions for manslaughter? But this was California in 1872, where Chinese testimony couldn't be used against white defendants, where 150 men could participate in 18 murders with only 9 facing trial, where the law bent itself into contortions to protect white perpetrators of violence against Chinese victims. The Supreme Court was about to demonstrate just how far that bending could go. Spring 1873. The decision. In late spring 1873, the California Supreme Court issued its ruling. All 8 convictions were overturned. The court didn't dispute the facts. It didn't question whether the defendants had participated in the massacre. It didn't even deny that Jean Tong had been murdered. Instead, it focused entirely on the wording of the indictment. The indictment was defective, the court ruled, because it failed to explicitly state that the victim had died. This omission was not a minor clerical error that could be overlooked. It was a fundamental flaw that rendered the entire prosecution invalid. The matter was remitted back to Judge Whitney's court for potential retrial. District Attorney Cameron Tom reviewed the decision and faced a choice. He could impanel a new grand jury, secure new indictments with the proper wording, and retry all 8 defendants. It would take months, it would cost money, and it would require witnesses to testify again about events that had occurred nearly 2 years earlier. Tom made his decision. He would not retry the case. In late spring 1873, Louis Mendel, A.R. Johnson, Charles Austin, Patrick MacDonald, Jesus Martinez, Refugio Botello, Esteban Alvarado, and A.L. Curly Crenshaw walked out of San Quentin State Prison as free men. They had served approximately 1 year of sentences ranging from 2 to 6 years. None would face further prosecution. None would be held accountable for their participation in the largest mass lynching in American history. The Los Angeles newspapers that had praised the convictions as proof that juries can be obtained in our midst to punish evildoers now said nothing. The Supreme Court decision merited barely a mention. Justice had not failed. Justice had been deliberately abandoned. The Chinese community scatters. The massacre and its aftermath devastated Los Angeles Chinese community. The population, which had numbered 172 before October 24, 1871, plummeted in the following years. Some fled to San Francisco, where a larger Chinese community offered safety in numbers. Others returned to China, unwilling to remain in a country that had proven it would neither protect them nor punish those who murdered them. A few relocated to other California towns, hoping that smaller communities might be less violent than Los Angeles. Those who remained lived with the knowledge that 18 of their neighbors had been lynched by a mob of 500, and every single perpetrator had escaped justice. The Chinese laundrymen who had refused to pay their business licenses in protest eventually capitulated or were driven out of business. The city could afford to wait them out. Economic survival demanded compromise, no matter how bitter. But the community didn't entirely disappear. In 1873, the same year the convicted killers walked free, California passed a new law that finally allowed Chinese testimony in court cases, even those involving white defendants. It was too late for Jean Tong. It was too late for Tong Yu's lawsuits. But it represented a small crack in the legal wall that had denied Chinese residents basic rights. The Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, known as the Chinese Six Companies, began organizing in California during this period. They would become advocates for Chinese immigrants' rights, providing legal assistance and political representation in fights against discriminatory laws. And in Los Angeles, slowly, quietly, a new Chinatown began to emerge. Not on Calle de los Negros, that street and its memories were abandoned, but nearby, Chinese merchants, workers, and families rebuilt. They opened stores, established businesses, created networks of mutual support. They refused to be erased. What happened to Tong Yu? Jean Tong's widow disappears from the historical record after her final civil lawsuit was dismissed in early 1873. Whether she remained in Los Angeles, returned to China, or relocated to another city is unknown. No monument marks her husband's grave. No plaque commemorates the spot where he was lynched. For more than a century, the massacre itself was largely forgotten, mentioned briefly in local histories, if at all. Tong Yu fought for justice in a system designed to deny it. She filed criminal complaints knowing they would be dismissed. She pursued civil suits knowing California law prohibited her testimony. She demanded accountability knowing it would never come. Her story is one of extraordinary courage in the face of absolute futility. She lost, but she refused to accept her husband's murder in silence. That refusal mattered. The legacy of October 24, 1871. In the years following the massacre, Los Angeles continued to grow. By 1880, the city's population had tripled. New immigrants arrived: Italians, Jews, Japanese, Mexicans. each group facing its own forms of discrimination, but none experiencing violence on the scale of what had happened to the Chinese in 1871. Calle de los Negros was eventually demolished. The plaza area was redeveloped. The Coronel building, where Chinese residents had taken refuge only to be trapped and slaughtered, was torn down. The physical evidence of the massacre vanished along with the legal accountability. But the massacre cast a long shadow over California's Chinese community. When Congress debated the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the first federal law to explicitly prohibit immigration based on race, opponents cited incidents like the Los Angeles massacre as evidence that Chinese immigrants faced deadly violence that American authorities refused to prevent or punish. The act passed anyway. For 60 years, Chinese immigration was essentially banned. The massacre also established a pattern that would repeat across the American West. Violence against Chinese communities, followed by minimal prosecution, overturned convictions, and deliberate historical amnesia. In 1885, white miners attacked Chinese workers in Rock Springs, Wyoming, killing 28 and driving hundreds more from the town. No one was convicted. In 1887, at least 34 Chinese miners were murdered in Hell's Canyon, Oregon. No one was charged. The message was clear. Chinese lives didn't matter. Their deaths would go unpunished. And within a generation, the crimes would be forgotten. 150 years later, it wasn't until the late 20th century that historians began seriously examining the Los Angeles Chinese massacre of 1871. In 2021, on the 150th anniversary, the city finally installed a memorial plaque near the site of the killings. The Los Angeles Chinese Massacre Memorial consists of interpretive panels telling the story of what happened on October 24, 1871. It names the victims: Dr. Jean Tong, Liang Kuai, Ah Long, Wan Fu, Tong Wan, Dai Qi, Ah Hua, Ho Hing, Lo Hei, Ah Wan, Wing Chi, Wong Chin, and 6 others whose names were never properly recorded. The memorial acknowledges what took 150 years to state officially. This was the largest mass lynching in American history, and it happened here. But it doesn't say what happened to the killers. It doesn't mention the 8 men who were convicted and then released. It doesn't name Louis Mendel, A.R. Johnson, Charles Austin, Patrick McDonald, Jesus Martinez, Refugio Botello, Esteban Alvarado, or A.L. Curly Crenshaw. And it doesn't tell Tong Yu's story, the widow who fought for justice when everyone told her it was impossible, who filed complaint after complaint knowing they would fail, who demanded that her husband's life be recognized as having mattered. Perhaps it should, because the Los Angeles Chinese massacre of 1871 wasn't just about 18 murders. It was about a legal system that chose not to deliver justice. It was about a society that chose to forget. And it was about one woman who chose to fight anyway, even when fighting was futile. Jean Tong was murdered on October 24, 1871, lynched by a mob for the crime of being Chinese in a city that considered his life worthless. His killers walked free in 1873. His widow's name was Tong Yu. And now, finally, you know the story that Los Angeles spent 150 years trying to forget. Chapter 4: The Memory That Refused to Die. Los Angeles, California, 1872 to 1875. In the spring of 1873, when Louis Mendel, A.R. Johnson, and the other convicted men walked out of San Quentin State Prison, Los Angeles's Chinese population was already disappearing. The massacre had destroyed more than 18 lives. It had shattered trust in a city that many Chinese immigrants had believed might offer safety, if not welcome. Within 2 years of the killings, more than half of Los Angeles's 172 Chinese residents had left, some to San Francisco, others back to China, a few to smaller California towns, where they hoped anonymity might protect them better than law ever had. But those who remained did something extraordinary. Between 1872 and 1908, the Chinese community of Los Angeles organized triennial public ceremonies called Qiao, or Ta Chiu, Taoist rituals designed to soothe the souls of the massacre victims, affirm Chinese-American belonging, and offer peace even to their attackers. Every 3 years, while the city around them tried to forget, the Chinese community gathered to remember. It was an act of spiritual resistance. The ceremonies said, "We are still here. Our dead still matter. And we will not let this crime disappear into silence." The New Chinatown. By 1875, Calle de los Negros had been largely abandoned by Chinese residents. The street that had housed Jean Tong's medical practice, where Ah Wing had been dragged to his death, where mobs had cut through adobe roofs and fired into rooms below. That street became a place Chinese families avoided. They rebuilt elsewhere, establishing a new Chinatown along nearby streets. It was smaller, quieter, more cautious. The community kept to itself, minimized visibility, avoided conflicts with white neighbors. It was survival through self-erasure, become so invisible that violence might pass you by. But survival is not the same as surrender. The new Chinatown grew slowly. By 1880, Chinese merchants had reopened laundries, grocery stores, and restaurants. Families raised children who had been born in America but would grow up under the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a federal law that banned Chinese immigration for 60 years and declared that Chinese residents could never become American citizens. The massacre of 1871 had proven that Chinese lives could be taken with impunity. The Exclusion Act of 1882 made it official policy. Chinese people did not belong in America, yet they stayed. They built businesses. They raised families. They held their chow ceremonies every 3 years, speaking to ancestors and attempting to heal what the law refused to acknowledge. What happened to the killers? The men who walked free from San Quentin in 1873 returned to lives that the historical record barely documents. A L. Curly Crenshaw appears occasionally in city directories over the following years, listed as a laborer, then disappearing entirely from official records by the 1880s. Whether he died, moved away, or simply fell through the gaps in documentation is unknown. Louis Mendel, who had received the longest sentence, 6 years for manslaughter, served barely 1 before the Supreme Court freed him. He vanishes from Los Angeles records after 1873. The others, Charles Austin, Patrick McDonald, Jesus Martinez, Refugio Botello, Esteban Alvarado, A.R. Johnson, similarly fade into obscurity. No obituaries mark their deaths. No descendants have come forward with family stories about great-grandfathers who participated in a massacre. The 142 men who were indicted but never prosecuted simply melted back into Los Angeles society. Some were prominent citizens. Some were laborers. All of them knew they had participated in mass murder and would face no consequences. They lived ordinary lives, raised families, died of natural causes, and were buried with their secrets. The system that freed them worked exactly as designed. Tong Yu's last stand. Jean Tong's widow filed her final civil lawsuit in early 1873, seeking damages for her husband's murder. California law still prohibited Chinese testimony against white defendants, so her case rested on whether any white witnesses would support her claims. None did. The lawsuit was dismissed. Tong Yu disappears from the historical record after that. Whether she remained in Los Angeles, returned to China, or relocated to San Francisco is unknown. She left no will, no property records, no death certificate that historians have been able to locate. But she left something else. A series of legal complaints that documented her refusal to accept her husband's murder in silence. Those documents survived in court archives, waiting more than a century for someone to read them and understand what they represented. Tong Yu fought a battle she knew she would lose. She demanded justice from a system designed to deny it. And because she did, her voice remains, faint but unmistakable, in the historical record. The ceremony of 2021. On October 23, 2021, exactly 150 years after Jean Tong locked his office door and felt the dread he couldn't name, Descendants of Los Angeles's Chinese community gathered near the site of the massacre for a memorial ceremony. The Chinese American Museum in Los Angeles had organized a week of events to commemorate the massacre. Historians presented research. Artists displayed works responding to the violence. Community members shared stories passed down through generations about ancestors who had survived or fled. On October 24th, the anniversary of the killings, a virtual ceremony was held to read the names of the 18 victims: Dr. Jean Tong, Ah Wing, Leong Kwai, Ah Long, Wan Fu, Tong Wan, Dai Ki, Ah Wa, Ho Hing, Lo Hei, Ah Wan, Wing Chi, Wong Chin, and 5 others whose names were never properly recorded. It was not the first time those names had been spoken aloud. The Chiao ceremonies between 1872 and 1908 had honored the dead, but it was the first time the city of Los Angeles officially acknowledged what had happened to them. In 2023, the City of Los Angeles Department of Cultural Affairs announced a competition to design a permanent memorial to the victims. More than 176 proposals were submitted. 6 finalists were selected, each offering different visions for how to mark the site where 18 men were murdered and their killers walked free. One proposal featured ghostly stone trees on the site of old Calle de los Negros. Another created a red brick sanctuary connecting opposite sides of Los Angeles Street, visually bridging the divide where the violence had occurred. A third proposed a series of interpretive panels telling the story in multiple languages. The memorial, when completed, will stand near the Chinese American Museum, close to where Jean Tong's office once stood. It will not bring justice. Justice is not available 150 years after a crime. But it will do something the courts refused to do in 1873. It will state officially that these deaths mattered, that the victims' names deserve to be remembered, and that the city's failure to hold anyone accountable was wrong. The question Judge Sepulveda asked. In November 1871, County Court Judge Ignacio Sepulveda stood before a grand jury and asked, "Shall law stand for naught?" The answer, delivered by the California Supreme Court in 1873, was effectively yes. When the victims are Chinese and the perpetrators are white, the law will bend itself into absurdity rather than deliver justice. But that is not the only answer the question received. Tong Yu answered it by filing complaint after complaint, knowing they would fail. The Chinese community answered it by holding Chiao ceremonies every 3 years for 36 years, refusing to let their dead be forgotten. The historians who dug through archives answered it by bringing the massacre back into public memory. The Chinese American Museum answered it by organizing commemorations. The city answered it, 151 years late, by approving a memorial. These are not legal victories. Jean Tong is still dead. His killers still escaped punishment. The Supreme Court decision still stands, never overturned, never repudiated. But memory is its own form of justice. Incomplete, insufficient, arriving too late to save anyone, but real nonetheless. The Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871 was a crime without legal consequences. For 150 years, it was also a crime without memory. Now finally, it is a crime that Los Angeles acknowledges. The memorial will stand on ground where blood was shed, where lives were stolen, where the law failed. And it will bear the names of 18 men who died because the city decided their lives didn't matter. Dr. Jean Tong was 42 years old when a mob lynched him on October 24, 1871. His widow's name was Tong Yu, and she refused to stay silent. Now, at last, neither will Los Angeles.